Guten Abend und herzlich willkommen.
Good evening and a warm welcome to you. My name is Imme Scholz and I'm on the board of Heinrich-Böll Foundation and I'm responsible for international work, and I'm really glad you all came to join us for the event of hunger in international conflicts forgotten. There is a real question mark behind the title, and I'm glad that we are also working in conjunction with the campaign against hunger, and I would like to welcome the representatives of that organization. Since 1966, the right to nutrition has been entrenched in the pacts of the United Nations, and also it is entrenched in the agenda for sustainable development goals. And nonetheless, despite this high priority, there is a high number of humans that suffer from hunger. And actually, it was around 757 million people in 2023. And what are the reasons for this high number of people suffering hunger and food insecurity? And this is where the title of this event is from. The right to food in conflicts. And, well, conflicts and wars are the most important cause of food insecurity worldwide, even more so than the equally alarming poverty resulting from social inequality and high food prices, as well as extreme weather events in the context of the climate crisis. 20 years ago, the United Nations adopted the voluntary guidelines on the right to food, and Germany has also committed itself to implementing them. Furthermore, it was in 2018 that the UN passed a resolution 2417, which clearly condemned the use of hunger as a weapon of war and the systematic denial of humanitarian aid by governments in conflict zones. Under international law, the occupying power is also obliged to ensure the supply of food to the population in occupied territories. Nevertheless, the FAO, the World Food Programme, and mentioned 5 particularly worrying hunger hotspots: Sudan, Palestine, that is the Gaza Strip, South Sudan, Haiti, and Mali. And we want to take a closer look at 2 of these regions, which is the Sudan and Gaza. It is, of course, extremely problematic to compare human suffering, and it's important for us to consider both contexts today with their own specificities without making any judgment or comparison about the degree of impact. Nevertheless, based on the official UN figures, it can be said that the conflict in Sudan, which has been ongoing since April 2023, has caused the largest number of starving people worldwide, while the proportion of the population affected by hunger in the Gaza Strip since October 2023 is higher than in any other context ever recorded by the UN. That means both hotspots stand for 2 very extreme scenarios. In concrete figures, this means that in Sudan, after more than 20 months of conflict, almost 25 million people, more than half the population, were suffering from acute food insecurity. In the Gaza Strip, it was in October 2024 that the IPC classified the entire region, the entire strip, as phase 4 emergency. Between November 2024 and April 2025, 1.95 million people, that means 91% of the population in Gaza, are subject to a high degree of food insecurity. That means phases 3 to 5. The deprivation of food and water also plays a central role in the argumentation of several human rights organizations as to why it is plausible to speak of a genocide in Gaza. At the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, with offices at the Horn of Africa, Ramallah, and Tel Aviv, we support the call for an immediate ceasefire in both contexts and a just peace for Israel and Palestine based on a 2-state solution and the protection of human rights. well, what is needed to achieve the right to food in Sudan and the Gaza Strip. We want to discuss this with excellent guests this evening. And I will now hand over to my colleague, to the experts and my colleague Lena Luig, and I wish all of us an exciting and a very informative and inspiring evening. Thank you.
Ja, herzlichen Dank, Imme.
Thank you, Imme. And a warm welcome also from my side. My name is Lena Luig, and I am responsible for international agricultural policy. And we are glad that we can work together tonight with people from Aktion gegen Hunger, campaign against hunger. And Michael Fakhri was supposed to be here, so I have to start off with a bad piece of news. Unfortunately, he cannot come. And, well, he's with his family in Lebanon, so the internet connection is not good enough. We may be able to get some impressions from him, but this was not clear until the beginning of this event. So he's sending his regards and apologies, and he wishes all of us a successful evening. So next, we want to hear another statement that we have, and Swantje Nilsson will now have the floor. She's department lead of international cooperation and fisheries at the Federal Ministry for Food and Agriculture, and I can already tell you that this ministry in this legislative period has made big efforts in order to achieve the right to food, and it's founded a dedicated department to this end. Thus, I'm very glad to have her here to hear her view. And a technical piece of information for people who do not speak either German or English. Please get a translation set, because we'll also have a mixed panel later. So now we have the next speaker. You have the floor.
Sehr geehrte Imme Scholz, liebe
Dear Imme Scholz, dear Gira Fischer, Agadam, and Jonathan Bauer, and Lena Luig, I'm very glad to be here and talk to you, but we said, well, the ministry is not responsible for humanitarian aid. We will discuss any other potential roles. And of course, we have had a long tradition in our dedication for the implementation and enforcement of a human right to food. And in this capacity, I will gladly report. And if you deprive people of the right to food, it means a destroyed future. And it certainly does not mean that we don't have enough food, but instead it is due to inadequate distribution and inadequate access to food and foodstuff. And we just heard that due to the climate crisis, oppression, conflict are the main cause for hunger. And these questions always are discussed in a context of human rights. And the campaign against hunger said that 85% of people suffering hunger live in conflict areas. And you all know these figures, but we have to repeat them again and again in order to really notice the pressing nature of this problem. The Social Report of the FAO on food insecurity in the world, dating from 2023, said 733 million people, and these figures are outdated, really, because this is always in a broad context. 850, then 733 million, and then after the pandemic, it's more again. So it is basically a structural problem that we need to solve. For us at the Federal Ministry for Food and Agriculture, it is not just these figures that are alarming, but also in the context of human rights, that 75% of people affected by hunger live in rural areas. And this is really shocking from our point of view. In those places where food really has its origin, despite everything else, despite all the developments, rural regions are the place for food production. So food is not even sufficient for people living precisely there. So this is a paradox that is hard to bear. And then we really need to inquire in the root cause of this. And it once again supports the hypothesis that hunger has structural causes. And at the Summit 2021, in this regard, it was said that a systematic and holistic approach for global feeding is necessary. So it is the entire supply chain for food, really. And the way we produce food, the way we consume it, and the way feeding our systems in conjunction with the Agenda 2023 and the Action Zero Hunger are all relevant in this context. Well, sustainable and resilient food and agricultural systems simply require a systemic, and holistic approach. So the human rights-based approach is really central here because it really shows the essence of the problem. And at my ministry, we are not responsible for humanitarian aid, but once again, it is always important for us to find the right interfaces. So whenever we move out of conflicts, we want to achieve resilient feeding systems so that people can implement their right to food in an autonomous way, the right to food, peace, and so on. So there are many additional factors, but this perspective simply needs to stay in the center. The right to food means adequate food, so it means sufficient and healthy. So it is also quality that is regarded here, not just quantity. At my ministry, we have a long tradition for that. That means the 20th anniversary of the voluntary guidelines and like action against hunger are flanking measures here, but we always hope to take additional steps. In 2022, we really focused our work on the implementation of these rights, and thus we also work together very closely with the Institute for Human Rights. And in addition to that, the agricultural ecology has been further developed with 13 fundamental principles that want to show the sustainable character in all its dimensions. So regional and local supply chains need to be developed, and they need to be analyzed. And is there a gender just access to food, and also the inclusion of younger generations, and then migration debates. They all enter into play, and thus we also work with the African Union because it is especially for young people that chances need to be leveraged in rural areas, and we hopefully can improve them further. We also have organizational tasks. We have created a dedicated department for the right to food, and based on our experience from the first 2 years, we broadened this view, and we just consolidated all these efforts so that cooperation in international, multilateral, and bilateral work is once again streamlined, and thus we really need a single approach. And the right to food and our department really reflects the broad character of these efforts. And it is a true paramount task. We want to develop it further, and it should translate in other departments of my ministry, but also in other departments and ministries. And cooperation cannot be overestimated. And on the other hand, it is not always easy. So you probably know that the implementation of the right to food, we have the food committee, for example, the World Food Committee, and it's really very important, and it's really bigger than the FAO. And I can also remember that in 2004 at the Conference for Politics Against Hunger, the third edition, we really created spaces. So the times are so challenging, and sometimes you don't even meet anymore because you don't want to meet in the same room anymore. For that reason, it is really important to create informal rooms to make people meet and encounter so that they can deal with these questions that are fundamental for the future of this planet, so that we can find constructive solutions and true progress. The Action Against Hunger has been created because it should create spaces also for informal negotiations at the fringe of official events. And thus we have created a conclusion of this voluntary guideline. It's 20 years old, and for the past 20 years now, it has been filled with life. And in addition to that, concerning this campaign for food security, we did not always want to create new efforts and organizations, but you really need to fill flesh to the bones of these concepts. And we are not always popular, and there are many processes, but it is a true government body, and it's bigger than a single organization, and thus it has many members, and all regions of the world are represented. And this is a real gem, because we also need governing bodies that really have statutes that are anchored somewhere, so that you have more than just a communication platform, so that you can make official commitments, so that we really will work in the same boat. And the framework for action for food security and protected crises, this may be an introduction for the upcoming discussion. In 2020, it has been passed in the framework of the CFS, and it really has a forward-looking, it has called for a forward-looking policy, so that the ramifications of conflicts on food security can be counteracted as early as possible. So this could be an introduction for the upcoming panel discussion. Well, before closing, I would like to challenge you with a few hypotheses that seem minor, but they're really important. So one hypothesis, we have everything we need, it's time to act. So we do have food, but we now need to provide its security. But with all these guidelines, we have great manuals, but we really need to make them more well-known, to really put them, turn them into success models, so that we can call for more, because we are living at a time of shrinking budgets, so they're not going to increase. And now I'm talking like a civil servant. It should be preferred to practice a forward-looking policy, and then we should actually do so and walk the talk. And we really need to talk with one voice, because the political situation that already started off on a complicated note will become even more complex. I think the right to food access and security is not a given. It'll be more and more difficult to reach more progress, and the debates are so on a decreasing level, really, and there are fake facts and fake news, and also when it comes to the awarding of funds, it's becoming more and more difficult. You all know the bicycle path in Peru. They have been used in order to improve development cooperation. So we need to explain why we want to achieve a certain goal, and we need the context, and this is why your presence is so important, because you are multipliers. And when it comes to the implementation of the campaign against hunger, action against hunger, you probably see it this summer, what examples have been successful. And third, we need to maintain the dialogue. I just mentioned spaces for dialogue. It won't become easier, and agriculture, that's very important for my ministry. We really need to understand the context, so we can't understand China and a problem of hunger. You need to understand demographic change, so you always need to see things in context, so you can't understand security policy, and every person really needs to drink, so food includes water, and then it means food. You need to have food on your plate, on your table. For that reason, it is so important. We sometimes lost these aspects out of sight, especially here in Germany, because, we do have a history of starvation right after the Second World War, but this has turned into oblivion, it seems. So we really need to do it in a triangle, so multilateral organizations at the African Union, and we do hope that the APP, the Agricultural Policy Dialogue, we have tried to include everybody on the spot so that you can reach out to others. You don't have to all the time, but sometimes you may not find an interlocutor where it would be possible. And we just had a very successful meeting where a trip was taken to Ethiopia and Zambia, and then you need to find interfaces, and then suddenly things get started so that the right to food can be implemented after all. So that's my fourth hypothesis. It doesn't work without cooperation. And then the initiatives for food and agriculture, and you need a healthy platform for that, sustainable resources that are accessible for the long term. And we also have a focus on Ukraine and the support for this country. So a policy based on solidarity, because we assume that this aggression on Ukraine is, to some extent, it used to be one of the biggest storages of cereals for the world. So how can we counteract developments that make this possible at all? So it is a breach of international law. It needs to stop. We need a platform and a basis for multilateral work, and also the restoration of the right to food access. So what happens after, hopefully, peace has been achieved in Ukraine, but this, of course, applies to all other hotspots of war in the world. And last but not least, a security policy, because securing the access to food and also access to good and healthy food, including drinking water, potable water, are essential rights, and the integrated security notion, also in national security policy, is the basis on which we work. And it is clear that we need a space for the implementation of the right to food. And please assist us. I was able to only give you one glimpse of this aspect. And what's really decisive for us at the ministry, you also need planning security, you need a perspective, you need peace, you need young people, you need women. So we really rely on good framework conditions so that we can move forward. For that reason, I really look forward to this panel discussion. So we need all interfaces for the implementation of the right to food. Thank you.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, Frau Nilsson. Ich wechsle jetzt
Thank you very much, Ms. Nilsson. I have now moved over to the panel, and we heard very important remarks from a member of the German government concerning the human right to food. And now let's move on to the two focus regions, that is Gaza and Sudan, for tonight. And now I would like to introduce our excellent panelists. And I would like to introduce our demon. She is a Middle East correspondent for CNN. She's an award-winning journalist, and she's also the leader of the INARA organization. And she has also directed the documentary Fees to Summit.
Dann sollte uns jetzt live dazugeschaltet.
And then we should hear Jean-Martin Bauer at the UN Food Program. He is a manager for food security and nutrition analysis at the World Food Program, and he has also worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Jean-Martin, great to have you here.
Und als letztes darf ich auf die
And last but not least, I would like to introduce Kira Fischer.
in der deutschen Sektion von Aktion
She
gegen
is
den Hunger.
at the German section of Action Against Hunger. It's a relief organization for hunger combating measures in conflict regions, and combating hunger is thus one of the thrusts of her work.
Aber meine erste Frage geht an dich. Wir hätten jetzt heute.
Awa, my first question is for you. So we should have heard from Michael Fakhri from his perspective of a special rapporteur concerning the right to food, and with a focus on food sovereignty of Palestinians. But maybe you are able to give us the Gaza context. Since the beginning of the war, the 7th of October 2023, you've been on the spot 4 times. You've seen a lot. You have worked on the ground. And could you please describe the situation of the population and also the situation of aid workers working on the spot? And what is your personal impression?
First of all, and thank you all for coming. To answer your question, actually, no. I can't describe to you what Gaza is like. Because even though I have a background as a journalist, and even though I'm meant to have words, I lost those words a long time ago. Because we tried to describe what the destruction and devastation of Gaza looked like. We were unable to. Even the images that you see of Gaza, you have to realize that what's being filmed, it's what you're seeing in front of you. When you're actually there and you see it all around you, it's a very different impression. When we talk about hunger. I mean, we've all been hungry at one point in time, right? We know what it feels like, that gnawing in your stomach, and you struggle to control your emotions, and you kind of feel like you're going a bit crazy. What Gaza's going through is that times a million. And what we face as aid organizations is these constant, deliberate obstacles that are being put in our way. And we can get into like a bit more detail in terms of the specifics of what they are. But before we move the conversation forward, there's a story I want to share that kind of, illustrates to a certain degree the severity of the situation. And so my last trip there, I was in Gaza City, and I was at one of a hospital that has one of the few small functioning rooms for malnutrition. And there was a little boy in that room, severely malnourished. His one leg was amputated, his other foot was amputated, and his body was just, it was too weak. It couldn't fight the hunger, and it couldn't fight the infection at the same time. And his mother, he'd asked his mother for a banana. And so his mother went out to try to find him a banana, but in Gaza City, a banana cost $25. In the bed next to him was a little girl who also had the metal rods in her leg. And the rods are about like this thick, the ones that she had. They were the same size as her leg. And she had been up at the Kamal Adwan hospital, which is in Jabalia, that was most recently raided and then shut down. Its hospital director was detained by the Israelis. So her father had wanted to get her down to this malnutrition facility because she was wasting away at Kamal Adwan. But ambulance evacuations aren't possible because the Palestinian Red Crescent is not permitted to operate its ambulances in these areas. So we had to take his daughter in that condition on the back of a motorcycle to this area so that she could get the nutrients that she needs. And the thing is it's not just a challenge of getting humanitarian aid in, it's also the challenge of the reality that Gaza's own agricultural infrastructure has been completely decimated. So prior to October 7th, when it comes to things like eggs and fruit and vegetables, Gaza was producing like roughly 70 to 80% of its own consumption. Now it's practically down to zero. And so, we try to use words like it's apocalyptic, it's dystopian, it's, surreal, it's like being in a science fiction movie. But I don't think the words exist right now to describe Gaza.
Ja, vielen Dank, dass du auch explizit darauf hingewiesen hast, dass es nicht nur darum geht.
Thank you very much for explaining that it's not just about getting humanitarian aid into Gaza, but also the agricultural infrastructure on the ground. I have got one question, because with the new Knesset laws concerning UNRWA, the Palestinian Relief Organization, this could have catastrophic ramifications as well. So once these laws enter into force, what would it mean for the population, for food supply, but also other rights?
We don't know. I mean, what we do know is that it's going to be catastrophic. And what we do know is that no organization can replace UNRWA because no organization has the sort of scale of operations that UNRWA has, the reach that it has, the number of staff that it has. But the other thing that we're also very concerned about is what does this mean for all of the shelters, like the UNRWA schools that have become shelters that have been deconflicted right now? Do they lose their status? Does this mean that, those shelters, even though they are still being targeted, are going to be targeted to a greater level? What is this going to mean? I mean, no one knows how to deal with this right now, even in the humanitarian space. The conversations are all very confused because no one can actually come in and replace UNRWA. I mean, will we somehow, and I say we, but will the broader humanitarian sector somehow stumble around and figure something out? I mean, sure, probably. Are the people going to suffer at a much greater level because of it? Yes, absolutely. And it's not just about food and shelter. It's also about, access to education and then the UNRWA programs that are outside of Gaza, that are in the West Bank, that are in, other areas, the clinics that they run. Ask anyone in Gaza and a lot of people in the West Bank, and they'll say that they grew up on UNRWA food parcels and went to UNRWA schools. So all of that is all of a sudden going to get eliminated too, and its impact is going to be far greater, I think, than what any of us can imagine.
Vielen Dank für diese Einschätzung. Jean-Martin Bauer, ich würde einmal...
Thank you very much for this account. Jean-Martin Bauer, I would now introduce your contribution. And you said that you can refer to Sudan. Well, can you please describe the context? Imme Scholz said it at the beginning. It's not about judging which regional conflict is, or which region is more severely affected by hunger, but what are the specific traits of Sudan? From the German side, I can tell you that the press coverage is far less than for Gaza. So what is happening in Sudan, and what is the work of the food program?
Largest food emergency in the world. The numbers are staggering. According to the analysis we released in the month of December, 24 million people currently need food assistance. It's the largest single caseload worldwide. The magnitude is really stunning. What's also stunning is the severity. Sudan is the third famine identified by the system we use to assess food insecurity worldwide. It's the third one this century, after Somalia in 2012 and South Sudan in 2017. So we're really in uncharted waters. What's happening in Sudan is quite exceptional. The famine started in the summer. It used to cover one camp, Zamzam camp in Darfur. According to the latest data we've been able to see, this famine has spread to new areas. As I speak to you right now, 5 other parts of Sudan are covered by famine conditions. The projection is that 5 additional areas will face famine conditions between now and May. And there are 17 additional communities of Sudan that face a risk of famine. So this problem is getting worse as time goes on. I'll give you a few numbers to indicate how concerning the situation has gotten on the ground. Food prices have gone up by a factor of 5 since the conflict started. The number of food insecure people has increased from 7 million before the crisis to more than 24 million today. So that's the numbers basically tripled. In the most affected areas, 1/3 of children under 5 are affected by acute malnutrition. And I could go on and on with numbers. 11 million people have been displaced in Sudan, a huge factor in the vulnerability of the country. And unfortunately, assistance has been too limited. Humanitarian agencies like the World Food Program do everything we possibly can to provide assistance to the population, but access is difficult. As is always the case when a famine occurs, there are significant constraints to accessing the vulnerable groups. And that means that people in the very highest and most vulnerable situations often don't receive the vital humanitarian assistance that they need. So again, Sudan is a famine. It's the 3rd this century. This is what hunger looks like in the 21st century. Back to you.
Vielen Dank, Jean-Martin. Das sind sehr, ja.
Thank you, Jean-Martin. So these are really shocking figures. Now, Kira, I would now like to hear from you, maybe also to give us a bird's eye view. Well, what is the origin of hunger in the context of a conflict? Maybe you can explain this based on your experience from different contexts of crisis, and what tools are there in order to implement the right to food in conflict situations. Thank you. Also, thank you to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for having me, and thanks for joining us, everyone. Even if we've heard it several times today, but we can't overstate it. Food is a human right. It's not a privilege and not a luxury, but it's a basic tool to survive. And this is what guides us in our daily work, also on the ground. Nonetheless, it is true that the as we heard it before, we should look at acute famine. This has affected 280 million last year, and this is 3 times more than 2016, and it's not getting any better. I also believe that people who do not work in our sector, but with the news, people are noticing increasingly Sudan, Ukraine, Gaza are conflicts, and that's the biggest driver of hunger and malnutrition. For that reason, it is so important, as it was mentioned before as well. This is why it's so important to sensitize the general public, and we also need call for accountability from different players. Events like this one, spreading the news, although it should be clear to everyone, is really essential. And this connection between hunger and conflicts, we are talking about a vicious circle that needs to be broken, which again is very difficult to achieve. It is man-made. It is not a natural disaster. This is sometimes lost in the general narrative. It's not man-made. And thus it should be noted that conflicts can lead to direct insecurity of food. If people are expelled from their land, where they work the land or their pastures, where they have cattle, where they have access to markets, where they can sell their surplus and generate a modest income, and to thus secure the survival of their families, but also agricultural implement on a small level with conflict or due to bomb shelling, it can be destroyed. And also, they can indirectly lead to hunger. You know, if conflicts interrupt food chains, supply chains, because everything is interrelated and interconnected. The war in Ukraine illustrated this very clearly, and it became internationally known, you know, because so many countries no longer got their cereal supplies from Ukraine. But it is not coming to a halt. And it is also on a local and regional level that food supply chains are interrupted. The prices are thus skyrocketing. A banana in Gaza, $25. It's inconceivable here. We wouldn't pay a fraction of that in Germany. And in Gaza, you would definitely not be able to afford $25 for just one banana. And it's not just about food, but it's also about clean, potable water. So this is what you also need to secure for the survival of humankind. And one thing is the situation during the conflict. So you can't work your land, you can't harvest, or harvests are destroyed, or also the harvest may be stolen by armed factions. But once a conflict comes to an end, the soil is contaminated with residues from the war, you know, not just for people, but also for the, not just for the general population, but especially for the farmers. And like in the war in Ukraine, there were videos to sensitize the general population where smallhold farmers developed technologies to find mines, and thus you need to make the ground accessible, and this may take no less than decades. And when talking about famine or hunger as a weapon, the 517 resolution by the United Nations was quoted already. And from our observations, that should make it more tangible. Well, it is not limited to just one conflict. There are several conflict areas that feel the same ramifications no matter where they are located. For example, not just the fact that the food chains are interrupted, but irrigation systems, drinking water infrastructure, the storage of food, So it is also the conservation of food that is essential. All this can no longer function. This leads to bottlenecks and decrease, and thus agricultural production is either limited or not possible at all. And the situation in Gaza, we saw it in the news, satellite images where the fisher boats were simply destroyed. So fishery is no longer possible. And another striking issue that is part and parcel of almost every crisis is that humanitarian aid really becomes a negotiable good, and it must not be questioned. So access for relief convoys is a big issue. And also concerning the resolution 2417, before I pass the floor back to Lena, for us and many other players in this field was a groundbreaking initiative of the UN. It was passed in 2018, and thus it was recognized that conflicts and hunger are inextricably interlinked. So two things were interlinked that we kept pointing to before that. So even if you do not have the official mandate as such, they simply belong together, the humanitarian ramifications, the hunger of political action, and then the conflict. And thus, you need political solutions to political problems, and anything else is just not sustainable. And not everything will get better this year, and armed conflicts will not be reduced, but we may come back to that. That was a good introduction for the next point. And you were just talking about humanitarian aid being entrenched in international law. The people killed, the aid workers killed, that provided humanitarian relief, 250 in 2023 alone, out of which 150 were killed in the occupied Palestinian territories and many more in Sudan. And thus, Sudan and Gaza are affected to a special degree. I would now like to have a second round of questions here at the panel. And after that, we would like to hear from the audience. And you can already develop your questions. And I would now like to ask the second question. Ms. Nilsson said that the Ministry for Food and Agriculture is politically not competent, so we tried to find a representative from other ministries. So this is just a disclaimer. We are not able to recruit them for this panel, but I can tell you that we have different members of parliament present here, and we are also in a constant dialogue with them. And your calls for action will certainly be heard afterwards. So Ava and Jean-Martin, I would like to ask the two of you what, from your point of view, are the 2 or 3 most important demands for the political community, and what players are in a specific responsibility in order to implement the right to food in the respective contexts. Ava, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to be very straight up about this. When it comes to Gaza, the inaccessibility of food, the vast majority of the responsibility for that, and the reason why the humanitarian conditions in Gaza are as nightmarish as they are, is because of Israel. This has been said from the very beginning. We're going to cut Gaza off from everything, and they did. And even when we had our maximum number of food trucks, which was nowhere near what is required by the population, it still wasn't enough. And right now the situation is worse than it has ever been. And I want to kind of just go into a little bit of detail. So Gaza is basically, I mean, it's split into 4 parts, but for the purposes of illustrating what's happening there, let's say it's split into 2. And it's split by what's known as the Netzarim corridor. So you have Gaza City and then North Gaza, and then you have central and southern. The vast majority of the population is in central and southern Gaza. This is where the so-called humanitarian zone is. That's not a humanitarian zone to begin with because it's not safe and the conditions there are inhumane. But irrespective of that, so there are a number of obstacles that we face as humanitarian organizations wanting to bring aid in. One is the trucks that Israel clears and permits to cross. And second is going to pick up those trucks. So I'm sure everyone's heard the Israeli officials coming out saying, oh, but we're clearing all the trucks and there's pallets of, humanitarian aid and the organizations aren't going to pick them up and it's all their fault and, Hamas is stealing the aid and so on. Here's the thing. It is true. There are pallets of aid at the Kerem Shalom or Kerem Abu Salim border crossing that we are not able to go pick up. Why? Because for us to go pick up aid, we go through what's known as a coordination process with the Israeli authorities. They give us the permission to go and pick up the aid. They tell us the route that we need to use and go pick up the aid. And this is down to such detail that when we move to do an aid pickup, we first move to a holding point. Then we wait for a green light and we move from that holding point to the pickup point. The big challenge, especially when it comes to picking up from KS, is that point, the holding point to the pickup point, is in Israel's red zone. It is in an active combat zone, and it is filled with criminal gangs and looters that Israel watches loot the aid trucks. And I say this is not Hamas because A, I know it's not Hamas, and B, logically speaking, if it was Hamas that was stealing the aid, why would Israel just stand there and watch them gathering, getting ready to burn the tires that they used to create blockades, shooting out the tires of aid trucks as they're coming through? So that's the big challenge that we face. The other issue is movement of aid from north to south or south to north. So for example, there's been a massive flour crisis in the south to the point where children were being crushed waiting in line for bread at bakeries because people were so panicked wanting to get that aid. And a more horrific incident that happened a few days ago where a child at one of the hot meal distribution points fell into a pot of boiling water, was screaming to death, but people were being so loud clamoring around the food itself that nobody heard this child screaming. That child is now dead. In the southern and central part of Gaza, for example, in December, a bag of flour, 25 kilograms of flour, cost $900. In Gaza City, that same bag of flour cost $1.50. And that is because Israel is letting plenty of flour into Gaza City. You can have all the flour you want to eat in Gaza City. Problem is, all you actually have to eat is flour. In the central and the south, there weren't really many fresh vegetables at one point in time. There was no meat produce whatsoever. Chicken just arrived last week. A kilo of chicken costs $80. A tray of 24 eggs costs $62, whatever. The thing is for the longest time, we as aid organizations have been saying, okay, well, look, if there's fruit and veg to a certain degree in South and Central, we'll buy that off the market. We'll do fresh vegetable parcels. Let us take it to the north where there isn't enough nutrition because you can't eat flour all the time, and let us bring the flour down to the south. We're not permitted to do that. And that just gives you a little bit of an idea of the obstacles that we continuously face, not to mention that one day one item is allowed, that the next day that same item is not allowed in a food parcel, and so the whole thing gets, turned around.
Vielen Dank für diese klaren Worte.
Thank you very much for these clear words. Jean-Martin, what are your 2 or 3 most important demands relating to Sudan, but also beyond?
Follow up with three things that also speak to the constraints we're facing. The number one thing that's required is safe passage. Safe passage, sustained safe passage to the people and the communities that are the most vulnerable. Right now, the World Food Program in Sudan has the people, we have the trucks, we have the food stocks, but what we don't have is safe passage. We will face obstacles by people on the ground that prevent us from taking that valuable food forward. So what we need is, the number one thing is safe passage. And that's the same thing in many of these food crises. We mentioned earlier on in this conference the situations in Haiti, in Mali, in Gaza. Quite often what's missing, it's access, it's safe passage. Sustained safe passage is the number one ask. The second thing is for the people on the ground to not shoot at us. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues died just a few weeks ago in Sudan in incidents involving the conflict in the country. People on the ground need to be reminded that humanitarians are not a target, that we're protected by international humanitarian law. If humanitarians aren't safe, if they're not safe, they can't take care of others. The last point that I want to make is that we need to make sure that the media, that public opinions in countries like Germany, but in the rest of the world, talk about what's going on in Sudan. Unfortunately, it's a crisis that's not on the front pages. The confirmation of famine conditions in Sudan barely made the news over the Christmas holidays. That just shows how that the country's not, that the emergency in Sudan isn't at risk of becoming a forgotten crisis. It is a forgotten crisis. We need to have the eyes of the world on Sudan right now. It was said that these food crises are man-made. And these three things I just mentioned, safe passage, protection for humanitarians, and keeping these crises in their limelight, these are things that human beings can resolve. Back to you, Lena.
Ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. And we want to make a contribution to the fact that Sudan should receive more media attention in the future. But as I said initially, that's missing in general. Well, Kira, you also indicated that you were going to come back to that. You have published a report from Action Against Hunger, so the resolution 2417 that you also mentioned, how it can be implemented in concrete terms. Can you give us some key facts, and what are your demands towards the political community in Germany and beyond? What should the incoming or the next federal government observe? Yes. And I think I can only endorse what the other speakers said. Well, this report as such has not yet been published, but it's only a matter of a few days or weeks until it will be publicly accessible. But I will quote from it recommendations from our side that I would like to share with you. The report in concrete terms is really, it has been conceived as a toolbox for various players, for ourselves as part of the civil society, for MPs, governments, local governments where famine prevails, or as giving nations as Germany, and for other players as well. Why did we create this report? Well, because we noticed that we could make a big report about hunger as a weapon year by year, but this would be repetitive, and at the age of the internet, you can also get such facts and figures from the FAO and others. So we told ourselves maybe it should be more accessible and more fit for practice. So what can various players contribute? So this is now an attempt to be more pragmatic in our recommendations for various players. The things I'm mentioning here may not always appear very innovative, but it may also show that the yardstick may appear high. It is low threshold, in fact, but what is necessary to achieve real improvement. I would limit myself to a few examples, both for governments and for civil society. First of all, safe passage, protection for aid and relief workers, then humanitarian diplomacy. So via diplomatic channels, like among friendly states, a cooperation must be initiated. States that have diplomatic relations should be able to mention things entrenched in humanitarian law, like hunger as a weapon in war. At times of war must be banned, and food supply must be supported, and relief workers need to be protected. That's one thing. And you also need to talk about the age of impunity in order to strengthen humanitarian international law, and the connection between hunger and conflicts need to be identified, and this also needs to flow into humanitarian strategies of giving nations, in other words, walk the talk. And what's also interesting, when talking about Resolution 2417, it is also considered to be an early warning system. So if you need to talk about imminent crises at an early point, and thus try to prevent humanitarian crisis, or at least prevent a deterioration of the situation. You need news for that, reports for that, and better reports from UN bodies, and states need to call for them. So hunger as a weapon of war is hardly ever on the agendas of the EU or UN. And for the next German government and for the time after the elections, we do hope that the incoming German government will emphasize the right to food and humanitarian aid, that it will be practiced. So we need a political and financial commitment. On the other hand, I'm not too optimistic because, well, budgetary constraints have also prevailed at the last government. So humanitarian cooperation have suffered. So it was also the draft that could be put up to question given the humanitarian crisis worldwide. And Ms. Nilsson is in the audience here. The ramification of humanitarian suffering are one thing, but the Development Aid Ministry and the Ministry for Food and Agriculture and the Financial Ministry should really work on this level, and then have project coordination at a smaller level. It should be improved so that the cooperation can become more effective, all the more so at a time of budgetary constraints. We, as such an organization, are also part of the system. In other words, we as a humanitarian and civil society organization want to generate an awareness for these complex facts. And we also want to work in an evidence-based mode. Reports, public relations, evenings like this one, but also private conversations are all very important. And also the media work. And these players, we can really be really interfaces, towards giving nations so that they step up their commitment, and also NGOs that, unlike us, are not located in Berlin, but in the regions on the spot. They have personal risks, the risk for their personnel, and it is also the ramifications of behavior when they get loud. They may be different. So who can address what and when, and how can we mutually support each other? And I think I would leave it here. Thank you. Were you going to add on that, Alva?
We also should be very cognizant of the fact that the minute we start saying hunger as a weapon of war, we are talking about committing a war crime. It is a war crime to collectively punish a population, no matter where it is happening and no matter which warring party it is. And I think we are at a stage right now where, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Sudan, no matter where it is in the world, governments need to be very conscious and aware of the fact that if they do not take concrete steps to push warring parties to allow for and facilitate the access of food, they are also being complicit in what is ultimately a war crime.
Vielen Dank für die Ergänzung.
Thank you very much for this addition. Now I'm looking at the audience, and I would now like to invite your questions for the panelists. And we'll also pass around a microphone so you can ask your questions directly.
Nur kurz, Mr. Fakhri's statement ist auch da.
Well, very briefly, and Mr. Fakhri's statement is here as well. Great, then let's take the first question, and then we can gather more questions, and then take a look at the statement. My name is Michael Röttger, and I'm from NFC Germany, and we share your experience in different countries. So we see so little of this, we just heard, or, the general public notices so little, so the pressure you can exert on governments is not always there. You were talking about Sudan that is experiencing the biggest famine and nobody is paying attention. So from the point of view of a journalist, the difficulties of the humanitarian aid workers and journalists are often the same when it comes to access. So maybe an assessment or your experience in your capacity as a journalist, what happens in this type of situation? Why are we not able to get these pictures out and export them?
One thing. So I am no longer at CNN. I left CNN 2 years ago, but I do still exist in the journalism space and in the humanitarian space. And I'm going to be very straight up about why Sudan is not in the news. The news is generally extraordinarily biased. Yes, there are access constraints. Yes, it's dangerous, but there are 1,000,001 ways to file a report using incredible local journalists and activists who are out there filming. And I think one of the main reasons why Sudan is not front page news every single day, quite frankly, boils down to, especially when it comes to Western media, well, you know what? It's happening in Africa. And that is what we need to change. And I think this is a huge moment where every single media outlet actually needs to ask itself why, and every journalist needs to ask themselves, why am I not fighting for this story?
Herzlichen Dank. Genau.
Thank you very much.
Wir machen eine ganz kurze Pause.
Thank you very much. We'll have a tiny break now, and we will continue gathering questions. But now let's make use of the opportunity to hear Michael Fakhri's statement that we missed earlier.
And I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. My most sincere apologies. I had intended to join you online. However, where I'm at now, unfortunately, has unexpected weak and very spotty internet. So I'm unable to come in on a strong connection. However, this event on conflict and hunger is incredibly important. And the least I wanted to do is send a message of my support of this event and the focus on this topic. Conflict is the leading cause of hunger around the world. And unfortunately, we're seeing the rise of armed conflict all over the world. In fact, what we're seeing is the increasing use of food as a weapon. We're seeing starvation campaigns being used by many forces all over the world. The most acute, of course, are in Gaza with the Israeli starvation campaign against the Palestinians, and with Sudan, with the civil war between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF, the Rapid Sudanese Forces. Both parties in Sudan are using starvation as a weapon, and the only people that are losing are the civilians. And the key thing to remember with how food is used as a weapon, whether it's Sudan, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Yemen or Haiti or Congo, again, we're seeing it more and more, whether it's in Azerbaijan against the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, is that starvation is only possible because certain forces have control over a food system, and there's always international support of these starvation campaigns. So even a civil war in Sudan, both parties are only able to starve civilians because of international support. Israel is able to starve civilians in Gaza because of the financial and military support of the United States and Germany. So the challenge we face is that all major powers on the Security Council, all permanent members on the Security Council, either directly or indirectly support starvation campaigns all over the world. Many rich countries directly or indirectly support starvation and the use of food as a weapon all over the world. This is the challenge that we face. But of course, the thing is with conflict is it's not that conflict is the immediate cause of hunger and starvation. Conflict arises often because of long-standing problems in the food system. We know that conflict is going to arise when we see increased rates of violence in food systems. So before there's armed conflict, if we're witnessing increased rates of human rights violations in food systems, whether it's gender-based violence, whether it's exploitation of workers, whether it's degradation of the environment or the attack against indigenous peoples and pushing them off their land, all these indicators, when they're increasing in rate, suggest that there will be armed conflict. So armed conflict isn't necessarily the root cause of hunger. Rather, it's the most acute moment after a breakdown in a food system. This is why a human rights approach is important. If you pay attention to human rights and human rights violations in food systems, that will tell you these are early indicators, early warnings that will be that suggest conflict, if not famine, is around the corner. I congratulate everyone on coming together on these very difficult topics. And again, I apologize that I wasn't able to attend, and I hope to be able to speak to these matters soon in person or online in Germany. Thank you very much.
Genau, jetzt können wir noch weitere Fragen nehmen.
Exactly, now we have time for some more questions, and I can see a question over here.
My name is Leila. I work for Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and I actually wanted to ask about the long-term effects of hunger. I mean, it's not that when a conflict is over and then people maybe have food again, then everything is fine, right? I mean, if babies have starved already in this, you know, when the mothers have been pregnant with them, or people have starved over a long period of time, then it's probably an issue they're going to have for life. It's an issue also for education with brain development and so forth. I mean, it's going to have a huge stunting effect on generations, I guess, both in Sudan and in Gaza. And I mean, to me, it's just an especially cruel war crime. If we speak about crimes, it's so cruel to have children and elderly people, and especially also vulnerable people, being affected by it. And I wonder a little bit about the lack of outrage. I mean, Sudan is not being reported on, Gaza is being reported on more, but anyway, nothing is really happening. And yeah, I wonder if maybe also like pointing out the long-term effects it has on a society, whether that would produce maybe a little bit more political outrage, action. It's a question.
Vielen Dank. Ich habe sowohl Jean-Martin als auch Awa schon nicken sehen. Ich gucke.
Thank you. I have just seen Awa nodding, and well, maybe we should have one or two more questions and answer them collectively.
Okay, guten Abend, Ulrike Bickel.
Good evening.
we have at least some small power. I was going to write to the media in Germany on Sunday. I couldn't do it because I had a long list of things to do, but I will do it tomorrow. Yesterday I've written to the German bishops what they do against the extreme right in Germany. So my next to do is I will write to the top media in Germany, because I also noticed there is nearly nothing about Sudan. And if several people do it, write to ARD, ZDF, Deutschlandfunk, maybe we can get them at least announce the pledges for help from Aktion Deutschland hilft and Bündnis Entwicklung hilft. It's nothing against the dying, but we can, with our power, do something to get the crisis into the media. I have at least some hope.
Dankeschön, eine konkrete Idee und genau.
A great idea. And then we have a question over here. Okay, let's have these two questions. Ms. Nilsson. Well, because I'm still among the audience, although Mr. Fakhri cannot hear me, it is a pity, because I think the report of the Special Rapporteur is very important. And of course, the countries should know that they're acting against international law. So we expanded our aid in Gaza. And, well, such accusations are not helpful. And I would like to discuss many things with them personally. And we, of course, deal with all the different accusations which exist in the international sphere. And we are really scrutinizing them. Thank you very much. And maybe after the close of this event, you may be able to have a bilateral conversation. So there is another question over here. Sorry, I just tried to structure my ideas. It has been mentioned several times, you know, lack of visibility and lack of pressure with Gaza and Sudan. And there has been such a lot of pressure in the streets for more than a year. And there are many workers from humanitarian relief. Where are you in the streets? Why don't you take to the streets? And you could be a very good advocate for many marginalized people to protect them from police violence. There are excellent networks also between Sudanese and Palestinian migrants, and they should network and make themselves heard. So where are you? I can't see you. Let's have a very short cut here, and let's hear more questions after that. So as an implicit question, I noted, what are the long-term ramifications of hunger? So Jean-Martin and Arva, you are welcome to answer both questions. And then where are humanitarian organizations when it comes to taking to the streets? Arva, you're getting ready?
Yes. So when we talk about, malnutrition and what happens to a young person's body when they grow up without sufficient nutrients, right? Your organs don't develop properly. You're more likely to develop chronic diseases. And keep in mind, please, that I'm not a doctor. And then you're also unable to fight disease and infection or illness. And so what you have, for example, in Gaza, which I've seen myself, and I assume also in Sudan and anywhere else where this level of malnutrition is being experienced, is that people can't fight off illnesses. They can't fight off the common cold. They can't fight off diarrhea. They can't fight off, hepatitis A is spreading. You don't have hygiene products to properly wash your hands. So it just further kind of compounds this cycle of misery and suffering. And then there's also, not to sound kind of clinical about it, but there's been some interesting studies also more recently into the psychological effects of starvation and what that does to a young person as they're growing up and moving into adulthood. Like, what is the long-term psychological effect of having been deprived as a child from access to food? And the other thing also that I think is worth mentioning, because it did kind of bring up as a fringe effect, is when we talk about starvation and hunger, we tend to think about the physical impact on the body. We don't think about what the other side effects of that is. The way that in conditions where access to food is so low, you end up seeing an increase in domestic violence. You end up seeing an increase in sexual exploitation. You end up seeing an increase in, trading sex for food, where, young women and girls and women are actually forced to become essential sex slaves to be able to actually provide for themselves. And you begin to see the traces of this. And unfortunately, we're already beginning to see the initial signs of this in Gaza, where obviously it's extraordinarily heavily stigmatized, but it is happening. And as for why people haven't taken to the streets, are you talking specifically about Germany or? Yes, sorry, I'm not from here. I spend a lot of my time in the field. But here's another important thing to point out, is that, this overwhelming feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, and this sense that what we're doing is too small. This is a deliberate, look, I reported and worked in war zones for 20 years. This is a deliberate construct of war that is developed by warring parties, and it is intentional to try to draw out conflicts to a point where, as the sort of ordinary observer, you feel like, oh, but there's nothing I can do about it. And so you turn away. It lulls you into apathy. And we need to be hypersensitive to the fact that this is a deliberate sort of weaponization of a conflict when it comes to how we as observers feel like we can engage and affect change. Warring parties deliberately want to make you feel helpless and hopeless, and as if your small actions do not matter, but they do.
Vielen Dank. Vielleicht ganz kurz noch, bevor wir zu der zweiten Frage kommen.
Thank you very much. Before moving on to the second question, and also Jean-Martin on the secondary effect.
As Arwa said, you've got individual impacts. Hunger, and it's not just not having enough food that day, it's being exposed to stress, to worry about where your food will come from. That's extremely bad for your body. It's extremely bad for your mind. Stress about hunger causes something called toxic stress, and it can impact your learning or potential for the rest of your life. Individuals that suffer from hunger will experience malnutrition, but it's also an important factor at the community level. Just think of what a community is like after 5-10 years of lacking food. What we see in these communities is quite worrying. When you've got long-term violence, this is something I saw when I was in Haiti. You also have people leaving these areas. There's migration, and that has impacts for the places where the migration occurs, but also the places that receive migrants. So it's always, hunger's more complicated than what you see at the moment. The long-term impacts can be quite political. So what all this says is that we need to win the peace. When the guns stop, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden food security returns to a conflict-affected area. In fact, what we see in the statistics is that food insecurity and malnutrition continue for years after the end of a conflict. And we need to be mindful of the fact that a country that's been at war for a long time isn't as able to feed itself as it once was. In the case of Syria, there have been profound demographic changes in the country. A lot of young adults, young men have left the country. And that just changes the potential of the country to produce and process the food it needs to survive. So we need to think long term. Someone now in the midst of the crisis in Gaza, and we're in the midst of the crisis in Sudan, needs to be thinking 10, 20 years ahead of time to ensure that this food crisis doesn't become a prolonged situation of need. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Genau. Kira noch zu der anderen Frage.
Thank you very much. Let's hear Kira. Well, I am willing to answer that question. It's not an easy question. It's a relevant question. Why are we not taken to the street to higher degree here as humanitarian organizations? And I think you are specifically referring to Gaza. If I may say so, it's good if we talk about such things, but it's really good to talk with each other and together, because the way you asked the question was very confrontative. So I'm Kira, I'm from Berlin, I am politically interested, and I work in action against hunger. So we are players from civil society. So I think we are really in the same boat, and we should recognize that we sometimes take on different roles, and we sometimes have to or should have these different roles. I'll explain that. We as organizations also have the Human Rights Film Festival in Berlin. We also showed a film on Gaza. We also offered discussion rounds. So we do that in the public sphere in order to really offer all these formats. However, you also need to understand who we are. We are the Berlin office. And when I go to work, I may go by bike, and there is a risk of being run over by a tram or a car. But basically, I don't have risks. I'm based in Berlin. Our colleagues are local workers. They are citizens of the conflict-ridden countries. They risk their lives every day in order to help their brothers and sisters in the country. And whenever comes to conflict parties, so they can't get the best out of the civil society. And we need to be neutral as aid workers. It is not about not having an opinion on the conflict, but we need to find access and acceptance to the local population during times of conflict so that we can provide relief. We must not be viewed as politically, as partisan or anything like that. And it's a very difficult balancing act for every relief worker. Otherwise, we couldn't provide relief, and otherwise we couldn't protect our own personnel. So these are the two prerequisites for our work. And, I would certainly not, just because of my, an outrage that we should have, but not just on Gaza, but on many humanitarian crises. Why are we doing so little? Why are we interested only in certain crises? It was mentioned earlier as well. You pointed to it. We are interested more in some regions than in others in the world. But I will certainly not jeopardize my colleagues. So some things, I only say them behind closed doors, but not on a panel. Thank you. Thank you very much. So basically, we are running out of time. I've accepted another question. And okay, if you have another urgent question, we'll have this one over here. But right in front of this door, you can have a pretzel and bilateral talks. I would also like to thank you for the contributions and also for this point that was made very strongly, the fact that hunger is man-made and that it is a political, not just a humanitarian question. For that reason, I'm really grateful that Mr. Fakhri, I think that's his name, that he mentioned this and that he also pointed to the spaces in Germany. And in this context, I would also like to react to the representative of the German government, because it's absurd. Germany supports the Israeli government politically, militarily, and also Germany, contributes to impunity. And Chancellor Scholz said we did provide weapons and we will continue to do so in August. In October, Annalena Baerbock said, well, if they hide in such structures, in Ukraine, they will lose protection, so that you kill hundreds of people just to eliminate or neutralize just a few people, And Israel was accused of genocide, and this rightly so, and Germany supports this and legitimizes this. And this is systematic in the spirit of German state reason that has no moral or legal legitimization. And for that reason, we need this kind of rhetoric. You know, what you are doing and what the federal government is doing all the time, you know, you need this kind of support so that you can justify this foreign policy at all. And I think this should not go without comment. Thank you very much for your contribution. And we've got one more question over here in the second last row. Thanks. Sarah Brandt from the German Institute for Human Rights. And I would also like to come back to the question of using hunger as a weapon of war and impunity. And we just heard this, a big necessity of creating accountability. In very concrete terms, we have a case where for the first time in history, the International Court of Justice has issued an arrest warrant against a prime minister and a former defense minister due to this actual starvation policy. It's a verdict, and of course, you always assume somebody is innocent as long as the opposite has not been proven. But apparently, you know, the ministry is not at this panel, and for that reason, I would like to ask the other panelists what their view is. It does not look as if there would be a trial in court, but nonetheless, the question of what you think. What is the obligation, or what should friendly states do? It's an important question. What is the responsibility of friendly states? And, well, it's an Israeli prime minister, but it could be another prime minister. And it's a very strong signal from the International Court of Justice. And what should the political reaction look like? Okay, one more question, as I promised.
Thank you for the good discussion. My question is from Arwa Damon. You were a couple of times in Palestine and Gaza. I wonder if you could tell us how the Palestinian people view the world now, including women and children. And my second question is about Israeli government, but if you find my question not relevant, you can simply ignore it. Why is Israeli government maybe the only government in the world that can cross any red lines?
Okay, es wird noch sehr politisch zum Schluss. Diese beiden Fragen.
Alle roten Grenzen überschreiten darf.
Okay, we are getting political in the end. Sorry, Jean-Martin. You should, of course, be a participant. Now, first, Ara.
It's fresh on my mind. I mean, I'm going to answer your second question first. It's because it is being backed by the world's strongest democracy and the entire Western world that is more than happy to apply double standards when it comes to what is considered unacceptable and what is considered a red line when it suits greater purposes. And these are the same entities, the United States and the West, who also actually gave directives of what a red line was to Bashar al-Assad's government. And then we're more than happy to see those crossed. And this is the same country. And it's Western allies that were more than happy to see, you know, the Taliban take over Afghanistan all over again and watch women's rights be completely and totally decimated and eradicated. And I think one of the big challenges is we're kind of in this era right now where everything is so polarized that conversation becomes hard to have because the truth is very uncomfortable. And I understand that. And when we start talking about uncomfortable realities, you tend to see people close up on themselves and not want to engage in conversation. I think this is a challenge that we all need to be very cognizant of when we're talking about things, and do a calculation of, is it better to shout or is it better to actually try to talk? And I think it all depends on the context of who you are and where you're in. As for Gazan's perspective on the world, Gaza is kind of like, it's shades of gray. And it's shades of gray of rubble and destroyed buildings, and you get these little splashes of color that are from, you know, an umbrella that's being used over a food stand, or like blankets that are being pulled across the broken bits of people's homes. And you really see the fatigue in people. You know, you see it in the way that they walk, and the way that they don't have light in their eyes. And Gazans themselves will describe themselves as having a very zombie-like existence. The thing is the world not caring about Palestinians is not something that's new to them. But there is, and the dehumanization of Palestinians is not something that's new, right? Like, Palestinians have been trying to prove that they live, love, and laugh like the rest of us pretty much for decades, which is a completely absurd thing to even have to do and say. And if you listen to what's being said now, today, it's not that different than what was said 10, 20 years ago. The level of what's happening right now against them, the level of impunity, the level of the global community's inability to effect positive change is extraordinarily hurtful. They feel abandoned. They feel as if no one values their life. And it's this compounding pain on top of the daily fear to know that people are willing to watch you die, burn, and starve. There's a lot of hurt in Gaza right now, and it comes at people every single day from multiple different directions. And the thing is, you know, Gazans are highly educated. They are very sort of worldly, politically, social media-ly savvy, including the children. And children are growing up basically being told the world doesn't care about you. Your life is not worth as much as anyone else's. And I think we're going to have to undergo a massive effort in this after sort of phase to globally reconcile with the people of Palestine.
Mein Arbeitstag beträgt jetzt genau 12 Stunden, deswegen Sarah, ich wiederhole noch mal kurz.
My working day has just been 12 hours, so just tell me if I misunderstood your question. You had just referred to the International Court of Justice, of Criminal Justice, and concerning political recommendations of what has to be done by politicians in order to avoid impunity. Is that correct? Fine. So, I mentioned it earlier under the header of humanitarian diplomacy, and double standards have just been mentioned. So, in public and behind closed doors, humanitarian international law, protection of the civilian population, and also the protection of humanitarian aid workers have to be mentioned and considered in every conflict with every government and towards every player you have access to. It may vary from region to region, of course, so you have to mention this all the time. So you can't say this in connection with Ukraine, something else with Gaza, and yet something else with Sudan. So you have to be authentic and simply refer to human rights, and thus the right to food is no luxury. Food is legally entrenched, but you can, of course, infringe this. But nonetheless, despite violations, the right nonetheless exists. And it sounds trivial, but as we know, it is a challenge to be coherent here. And something that may be an issue when looking to Germany, the election campaign, and depending on who will be the biggest opposition party, many have a guess of what this will look like. And the ruling party, well, we don't know yet, but that such topics really have to be seriously discussed. It is not a topic where you can get popular. It is domestic policy that is important here. People are fearing for their jobs, and the economy is going down the drain. But the political community, and we as civil society, like hunger crises, violations of international law, of humanitarian law, need to stay on people's radar. So it must not be an invention of political players who can contribute money or whatever, but it works with political will, yes, but the awareness in civil society need to admit that it is our shared values that reach beyond national borders. And a demonstration for the right to food, that would be desirable, but it will be similar like the situation here. Some rows will be empty because we can order food from a mail order service or go to the supermarkets. So often this topic is submerged in our everyday lives. We need to make political claims, but we need to find it important as well. And this is what I sometimes doubt. Jean-Martin, a few closing remarks?
To repeat that some of our key values are in danger. The questions that were asked now do really cause me to pause and reflect about what I'm seeing. Last year, more than 280 humanitarian workers were killed in the field. The system is under attack. There's a reduced commitment to multilateralism internationally. And the result of that is that the food crises the world is going through are getting more severe. Sudan, Gaza are examples. Right now, there are 1.9 million people who are facing the worst level of food insecurity in the world. That's what we call catastrophic food security conditions, IPC Phase 5, for those of us who look at the technical terms. This is something that didn't exist just a few years ago. We didn't have such severe food insecurity in the world. We've also had a substantial increase in the number of people facing acute food insecurity, rose from about 130 million before the pandemic to 350 million today. So we're not on the right track, and our ability to manage conflict or inability to manage conflict is one of the key reasons and key factors behind it. Now, a lot of the questions I heard at the end of today's talk were about what can we do, and I agree that individual action is one of the key ways to move forward. What the grassroots can bring in terms of their contribution to the political processes is extremely valuable. And again, we're facing something that's man-made, and human beings working together can do more. I would point people in the direction of UN Resolution 2417 about accountability for starvation and war. It's something that took a very long time to come together. It took decades. If we just think about where the system was after World War II, where starvation and war was seen as a legitimate, if ugly, tactic of war, we've come a long way. We shouldn't give up now. What we should do is hope that the Security Council takes this tool and makes the most of it to avoid us being in a situation where hunger just keeps marching forward. The world deserves better than that, and the children of Syria, Sudan, and Gaza deserve better than that. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Jean-Martin.
Thank you very much, Jean-Martin. This was a very interesting discussion, and let me summarize. Everybody agreed in saying that it's really important to talk about this difficult topic, and there are different perspectives, and to nonetheless maintain the dialogue, we are all called upon to call for the human right to food. International humanitarian law needs to be kept up. We must not be discouraged, not as citizens, not as civil society. I'm really glad about this exchange and the fact that we can continue outside, and I would like to invite everybody to the informal exchange and our cooperation partners' action against hunger. Thank you so much. I think all contributions were equally valuable. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you for coming, and have a good evening.